Hi, I'm Lindsay Hall, Head of ESG Thought Leadership at S&P Global.
And I'm Esther Wielden, a Senior Writer on the ESG Thought Leadership team.
Welcome to ESG Insider, a podcast hosted by S&P Global, where we explore environmental, social, and governance issues that are shaping investor activity and company strategy. In mid-July 2021, the heaviest rainfall in a century triggered intense flash floods, inundating several towns in Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium, and causing at least 188 deaths. While it's hard to link specific weather events to longer-term climate change, scientists are certain that a warming Earth will trigger more extreme weather events.
The floods in Europe are a reminder that although emerging markets are likely to be hit hardest by a temperature rise, richer countries in the Northern Hemisphere are far from immune. The destructive climate events will hit not just the citizens of Europe and the US, but also asset managers, insurers, banks, and the physical infrastructure owned by companies.
In this week's podcast, we're delving into a fresh analysis from S&P Global TrueCost to understand what the main climate-related physical risks are facing Europe, and which countries are most exposed. We also interview a prominent climate scientist at the Grantham Research Institute, an analyst from German bank Berenberg, and an economist at the large asset manager Schroders.
For this episode, we are joined by our colleague Gautam Naik. He's a senior writer on the thought leadership team at S&P Global Sustainable One. Gautam, can you summarize for us the main findings of the TrueCost data?
Sure, Esther. The main culprit behind Europe's recent flash floods is, of course, excess rain. But our data shows that the main climate-related threat to Europe is actually the very opposite scenario, water scarcity. According to S&P Global TrueCost data, Greece, Italy, Spain, and Belgium are among the European countries most exposed to water stress between now and 2050.
What about other dangers, Gautam, like storms or river flooding? Does TrueCost analysis shed any light on those?
It turns out that cold waves are the next most prominent climate risk among 10 of the richest European countries. The next important threat is an increase in heat waves. To get some insight, I turned to Svenja Serminski, a scientist at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics.
The connection between climate change and rainfall is actually quite complex, but we have more and better understanding and knowledge. And what it basically boils down to is that we have rising global temperatures, and more water evaporates from the land and from oceans, and the warmer atmosphere then can hold more water. And that means that when it rains, there's a higher potential for very heavy rainfall, which then can cause inland flooding. And I think the big feature here is, the rain has to go somewhere, and it becomes so toxic when it hits areas that, do not really provide good runoffs. And that could be in an urban context, that could be where you have these narrow valleys, what we've just seen in Germany, but also where land use practices basically have left landscapes less able to accommodate heavy rainfall. So it's really a combination of this shift in climate, but also the way that, we basically deny the water to disappear.
I pointed out that there seemed to be a contradiction. We've all seen the news about Europe's flash floods, and yet our data suggests that the real threat is water scarcity. How can both be true?
We have to look at the spectrum of climate impacts, and drought and water shortages are already a key challenge for many areas across Europe. And in fact, some of the areas that have recently seen these dreadful flash floods are actually also on the trajectory to, on average, experience water scarcity and droughts. And that doesn't stand in conflict. What we need to understand is climate change means that we will see more extreme events. So, if it rains really heavily, but there are longer stretches without rain. We've just a couple of weeks ago released the UK climate change risk assessment, which looks at all the risk, climate-related risk across the UK. And yes, flooding is a big concern, but also drought and heat are key drivers of risk and are increasingly of concern, particularly in the south of the country. And that's the same across Europe. So it's really to understand what climate change does, it makes things more extreme.
In August 2018, asset manager Schroders did some research that showed that while many capital-heavy businesses understood the physical risks from climate change, the subject had only received limited attention from investors. So I asked Irene Lauro, an economist at Schroders, whether things were any different today. They're a lot different, she said.
I think that now climate change is becoming a key factor in how investors evaluate company strategy and performance, and they recognize that the financial sector is starting to play a key role in supporting sustainability. I think this is because really investors can help build environmental resilience by decarbonizing their portfolios, but also redirecting investments in solutions to tackle climate change.
Investors, no doubt, have taken note of the spate of severe weather events in recent weeks, from severe flooding in Europe, China, and India to an intense heat wave in the Pacific Northwest. Irene Lauro says these events are all part of a larger warming trend.
Globally, we find that the average number of tropical hurricanes in a decade has gone from 14 to 23 since the start of the 1980s, while the number of floods has almost doubled since the 80s. Economic losses due to extreme weather events have also increased since the 80s, and our analysis shows that the average economic loss from hurricanes and floods has risen substantially over the last few decades for the majority of countries that we considered. In particular, we saw that the US, for example, is the country most affected by tropical hurricanes, and the US recorded an estimated damage of 24 billion in the first decade of the 2000s, and this was up from only 2 billion in the 80s.
In Europe, flood risk remains one of the most uninsured risks. I asked Michael Huttner, insurance analyst at Berenberg, what the impact of the recent floods might be on insurance companies.
We published, I think on Monday, a short note saying we estimated the flood losses for Germany to be around 2 to 3 billion euros. And the GDV, the German Insurance Association, I think yesterday updated, and obviously they have much better insight, and they gave a figure of 4 to 5 billion. So not quite twice, but close enough our figures. And of course, this excludes Saxony, which is another area affected, and it excludes Belgium. So the losses were bigger than we thought. The main source of secondary perils in Europe is floods. It represents somewhere around 3/4 of all secondary perils. In the US, it's a very small proportion. US is mostly affected by convective storms, so big thunderstorms. And the third point is that these floods are shocking for two reasons. One is unusual, but the second is they come close on some other floods we saw linked over here to storms at the end of June. So two close secondary events, kind of almost back to back.
Today, thanks to big strides made by scientists in modeling physical climate risks, insurance companies, banks, and investors can model far more accurate scenarios for the coming decades. But not all companies are tapping into this rich and vital data. Here again is Svenja Serminski of Grantham Research Institute.
Fortunately, our understanding about risk trends is increasing, and the science has actually come a long way. So we have quite a good way of projecting how different sort of future climate scenarios could then play out in terms of the impact. So sea level rise is obviously a big concern for coastal areas, and I think this will then there are chances of coastal erosion, and we have some areas also here in the UK, but also across the continent, and you mentioned the Netherlands, that are already exposed just purely because of the fact that they are already quite low-lying. So that's one observation. Then I think the key point is around the exposure to droughts, and where droughts are actually hitting our infrastructure or existing systems. I mean, we've seen this a lot over the last couple of summers, where actually a lot of infrastructure are exposed to lack of water because they've been built either with the assumption that river levels will continuously be at a certain level, and when that goes down, we've seen this along the River Rhine. Actually, at some point they had to reduce or actually stop the shipping on the River Rhine because of lack of water in there. And that has implications not just for transport and transportation of goods, but also for the infrastructure along the river. So it just gives you a flavor. I think the best way, if you want to understand, what the different risks are across different regions, is to look at some of the assessments that have been produced. For example, the European Environmental Agency regularly comes up with risk maps. And I think that's actually a really important point to sort of visualize, where you are. Also, individuals or businesses can often use, sort of their postcode or their location data to get a sense for, what does it mean in terms of current risk and future risk. And I think there are quite a few of these tools now available. My experience is that a lot of businesses often, do not access them or are not aware. And then also individuals often do not really utilize the information. I think that's a big challenge for us as the research community to make sure that that information is actually reaching people who can then make decisions about, where to build, where to live, how to build, what kind of processes to run. So I think that's a big lesson also for us scientists to learn.
Irena Lauro of Schroders points out that while many investors see climate change as a long-term problem, the flooding in Europe is another stark reminder that a warming climate can have more immediate consequences too.
Many investors think of climate change as a long-term phenomenon, but it's not over the long term that climate change can cause economic damage. And extreme weather events is probably the providing the evidence that climate change has a short-term impact too. Think, for example, at hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Katrina, and Sandy in the US. They have already shown how damaging climate change can be today, and they probably represent some of the most visible examples of the short-term consequences of a warming world. So I think that as temperatures will keep rising, these events, as also highlighted by the IPCC analysis, this event will become more frequent and more severe. And really, investors' interest towards understanding climate-related risks will increase, especially in developed markets where we are going to see a lot of flooding and a lot of storms in the short term as well.
And yet, while it might be easy to measure the losses from, say, a big flood event, what about more complex scenarios such as water scarcity? Do insurers and businesses know how to quantify those?
Water stress is something I hadn't even thought of. So that's, the answer is really crystal clear here. We rarely think about the impact of drought and dry grounds and I guess subsidence or whatever for the insurers in Europe. So I guess that gives you an answer. And I'm trying to think of when companies talk about their weather losses, whether they include these events, they probably slip under the radar.
The recent flooding events in Europe and elsewhere have clearly sounded an alarm to investors, financial institutions, and companies that the physical risks of climate change are growing. They can turn a blind eye, or they can adapt.
Schroders' research on 30-year equity returns, for example, has shown that equity returns will be impacted by climate change through its effect on productivity. And the bottom line? All major economic players need to start modeling physical climate risks into their long-term business strategies.
Thanks, Gautam, for coming on the show today. And to our listeners, please stay tuned as we track the growing risks of climate change.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of ESG Insider, and a special thanks to our producer, Kyle Cangelosi. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and sign up for our weekly newsletter, ESG Insider. See you next time.